Welcome to chessopenings.com. Today we're going to look at the Ruy Lopez, which is a fantastically popular opening for white and allows white to put considerable pressure on black from the very first moves. Let's take a look. Play begins with the move pawn to e4, aiming to set up a classical pawn center with d2 to d4. And to prevent this, black plays pawn to e5. Now, white's big goal is to put substantial pressure on black by first attacking the e5 pawn with the move knight f3, and then he's also going to want to play for pawn to d4, usually after he's played c2 to c3 first. That way he can recapture with a pawn. So white's next move was knight to f3, and after black defends the pawn with knight to c6, white puts further pressure on the pawn with the move bishop to b5. This continues to put pressure on e5 by attacking the pawn's only defender. And now this leads to the Ruy Lopez. This is the Ruy Lopez position, which is also known as the Spanish. Now, if we're handling the white pieces, our goal in this position is to just gradually build up pressure against the e5 pawn until eventually we can force black to make some kind of concession. Maybe he'll have to play pawn to d6 and take on a space disadvantage, or secondly, he might have to lose some time defending the e5 pawn. So white's goal is just to put pressure on black's position and very gradually build up an advantage in the center. So how does the Ruy Lopez unfold? Well, you may be surprised that black's most common move here is to nudge this bishop with pawn to a6. Now, wait a minute, doesn't this just lose the pawn on e5? We just said that white's whole aim was to take out this defender and capture on e5. Well, it turns out that at the exact moment, black would simply have a fork trick with the move queen to d4. And this would be winning the pawn back due to the double attack here. So the threat to capture on c6 and then on e5 is actually not serious just yet. Instead, white often retreats the bishop to a4 in this position. Now, by inserting this move pawn to a6, black is really saying that as soon as I really get worried about that threat to the e5 pawn, I'll just play b5 to kick the bishop. So what normally happens here is that black simply continues his development with knight to f6, white castles kingside, black plays bishop to e7, and now after this move rook to e1, it's finally time for black to do something about this threat to the e5 pawn. If, for example, he just had a lapse of attention and he just played castles kingside, he would now lose a pawn after bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes pawn. And now in this case, this fork trick, queen to d4, doesn't do a whole lot since the rook is holding on to this e4 pawn, and white would simply play knight f3 and it's just time for the queen to retreat and black is down a pawn. So it turns out that at this moment, black is actually obligated to do something about this threat to the e5 pawn. So black's reply here is nearly always pawn to b5. And after bishop to b3, black further shores up the pawn with this move pawn to d6. Now, this is kind of a good situation for white. This is the sort of concession we wanted to make. By forcing this pawn to d6, we've kind of caged in one of black's bishops in this position, and we've given black a slight space disadvantage. So white now prepares his expansion in the center with pawn to c3. And after black castles, we play this important little move, pawn to h3. This is all about control of the center. White knows that if he just goes ahead and plays d4 immediately, this pin will give black extra chances to influence the center. He's actually using a light squared bishop to attack a dark square by threatening to exchange for the knight. So white actually plays pawn to h3 first to eliminate this move, so that black won't be able to pressure the center. And this position is one of the most important starting positions of the Ruy Lopez, and it's called the closed Ruy Lopez, or also the closed Spanish. White's basic aim in this position is going to be to achieve the move pawn to d4, and then he's going to want to reroute this knight. This is a very common maneuver. He's going to bring it to d2, and then to f1, and then he's going to select between e3 or g3 for this knight. And this is white's basic setup. And then, at that moment, he's got a few different plans that he can pursue. One is to go ahead and just attack the king side, which is a very popular strategy and very effective. He can also sometimes take a crack at these queenside pawns with a move like pawn to a4. Or thirdly, he might just open up the center and launch an attack there. Now, Black's just not going to sit around and watch all this happen. Black has some ideas of his own. Normally what he's going to do is he's going to gradually reposition his pieces. He's going to play behind the pawns for just a moment here. And then he's going to try to build some counter chances on the queen side where he has more space. And we're going to get a chance to see some of those strategies in just a moment. So one popular plan for Black here is to play knight to a5, and this is known as the Jagoran variation. And after White gets his bishop out of dodge, he's going to follow up with pawn to c5, adding more support to the center. Another more modern plan would be to reposition this knight to b8, and in this case it can find a new home on d7. And then again he will use the c-pawn to contribute to the fight for the center. So both of these options are very popular ways for Black to get some good play in the Ruy Lopez, and I enjoy this position with both sides. If we back up, there are some other ways that Black can handle the Ruy Lopez. One sharp variation is called the Marshall Gambit. And in the Marshall Gambit, instead of submitting to a space advantage, Black goes directly for a pawn sacrifice in order to get his pieces very active. The Gambit runs castles here instead of d6, and now, after the move pawn to c3, Black strikes with pawn to d5, and this is actually a gambit because after White captures on d5, takes and takes, the e5 pawn is actually just undefended and White takes it for free after knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, and rook takes knight. So why would Black just allow White to capture a pawn like this? Well, just take a look at White's pieces on the queen side. These pieces just haven't really got a lot of play here. They're still sitting on their home squares and actually cannot develop very easily. On the other hand, Black's pieces get very, very quick play in this position. So after Black plays pawn to c6, which he needs to play in order to defend his knight from a threat here, White most often continues pawn to d4. And now Black plays bishop to d6, the rook retreats to e1, and now look at how rapidly Black is starting to get some real attacking chances. He's got both bishops gunning in here, a knight in the center, the queen occupying an active post, and right now he's got a threat on h2. So after White plays pawn to g3, Black plays queen to h3. And this is one of the starting positions of the Marshall Gambit, and Black's goal here is very simple. He wants to break through the kingside position with ideas like bringing the bishop into the attack, swinging a rook into play here, and maybe using this f-pawn for a break. A very messy situation I have on the board here for you, but you can see that this is a very dangerous line, and there's a lot to be learned here from studying lines like this for both sides. With Black, you learn how to play with the initiative. With White, you learn that being up a pawn is really a good situation, and that if you can survive an attack and study very carefully how you handle these positions, there's a lot of games you can win with White here as well. Studying positions like these is always a huge pleasure since it teaches us so much about chess. A lot of players are a little bit too afraid to play something like this as White, since we have a bias towards being the attacking player and we don't want to defend very much. But if you're willing to do a little homework and think deeply about chess, you'll find that you can win a lot of games in positions like these, both with White and Black, and that your whole understanding of chess will improve. If we move back, White has a number of ways to avoid the Marshall Gambit. The most popular method involves playing pawn to a4 after Black castled. And this takes advantage of a little detail in Black's move order. Let me show you really quick that the most popular move here was pawn to d6, but if Black wants to play the Marshall Gambit, he doesn't play this move. Well, now in this case, if White were to play a4, Black's instinctual move here would be to simply play something like bishop g4, which gives this bishop an excellent spot, and since the queen now defends the rook, there's no threat of pawn takes pawn because, well, black can simply recapture. So this was not a big deal in this case. However, in the Marshall Gambit, black castles. He has to delay moving the d-pawn because he wants to bring it to d5 in one go. And in this instance, this gives us a little opportunity to take a crack at these pawns with pawn to a4. Now, theory doesn't say that this move is better than c3, but it at least gives white some chance to play for the initiative without having to worry about the early attack. And here, black is missing this instinctual move bishop to g4. So this just shows you, one of the ideas which white has to avoid the Marshall Gambit, and it proves that white doesn't necessarily have to take this position where he's just under attack for the pawn. Now, black has a few more ideas, but I want to get to one that's been very popular recently, which is known as the Berlin defense. And the Berlin defense begins when black plays, instead of pawn to a6, he plays simply knight to f6. And now, after castles, the idea in the Berlin defense is that black's just going to rip this pawn off the board, and he's going to flagrantly open up the position, even though he's lagging in development, but he says that he can get away with this for a few reasons here. And mainly what he's going to do is he's going to target the bishop pair. So after white plays the move d4, theory says that this is the strongest move. Black now plays knight to d6, attacking this bishop. And now white plays bishop takes c6, pawn takes bishop, and pawn takes pawn, recovering the pawn. And now after knight to f5, white trades queens on d8, removing castling rights from black. And white simply continues development. And now this leads to a queenless middle game, where white often searches for direct attacking chances on the king. For example, a very common motif in this position is to break with pawn to e6 at some point, and to try to put immense pressure on black in this position. Black will gobble up some additional time with his king, but what he's counting on here is that he has the bishop pair, and he's got a strong grip on the light squares in this position. For example, the knight sits in a very healthy square here, and white has found it very difficult to make practical chances in these positions. White has to know what he's doing in order to get an edge here, and it can easily backfire on white, as in the long run, the bishop pair may end up to become a strong positional force. Well, that wraps up what I wanted to share for today. There are a few other interesting strategies for black, but I tried to focus on the most critical and instructive options that black has so that we can get a sense of how the Ruy Lopez works. But your journey doesn't have to end here. I hope you'll review this video and you'll consider adding the Ruy Lopez to your repertoire, either with white or with black, or even with both sides. There's a lot of really interesting and engaging chess here, and I think it's just a fantastic opening for either side. That's it for today, and I hope to see you again.